Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassell.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it.
You know, last time we were together, we were talking about how privileged we are to live when we do.
Yeah.
And the things that we have. And in the week since we've been together, the things that have been happening make it pretty clear to me that we're at a grand inflection point in American history, for sure, maybe world history. But there's two ways of looking at that. One is AI. What it's doing to the world in general is what the internet did. You know, and before that, computing, and before that, you know, the discovery of the atom, and you can see successive ones. But we're in another massive inflection point, potentially and probably very positive. We worry about the negatives. But the other one is what's happening in our government. Right? In the last week, the things that have happened just are astounding.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you now have Trump. And it's really more Trump than it is the Republicans in Congress at this point. All the initiatives are taking place. Now, that doesn't mean that initiatives in Congress won't happen.
Right.
But all of the changes are a function right now of executive orders. And everything that's being discovered is a result of the executive orders. And in the last week, Elon Musk has uncovered in his I think he's up to 50 people, and they're discovering all kinds of waste, fraud, and abuse.
He's up to 50 people in the Doge.
Yes, in the
Department
Doge
of
group.
Government. Okay.
So he's got some very, very smart people, and they're digging into data that frankly in my lifetime nobody's ever dug into.
I'd never heard of these systems that they're now dealing with.
Right,
and these payment systems, these electronic things, they're now looking into and seeing this. These worms crawl out from under rocks.
Yeah, and they're finding they find the exact label for the spending. In other words, it isn't like $20 million went to help people in Africa. It's the details of that $20 million, and we're finding out that in many cases it didn't even go to Africa.
Yeah.
Went someplace else. But
right.
But he's uncovering all that. And it's quite astonishing, but it's also the way the Democrats are reacting to it is what Elon Musk is what he's doing is wrong, and
illegitimate because he's not a branch of government. I've heard them say.
Yeah, and that gets into it. And what I'm getting ready to say is I'm trying to distinguish here between what he's doing is wrong, and then they're also claiming it's illegitimate. Okay, and I'm saying that those things are close to the same thing,
but they're different.
But now they're trying to delegitimize his activities and try to act like they didn't even happen because they're illegitimate.
Right.
And the term that they're using now is constitutional crisis. They're saying this is a constitutional crisis, and of course, that's what they also said during Trump's first term. They regularly referred to this as a constitutional crisis, which for me it kind of begged the question: what do we need to see? What would be the indications of a true constitutional crisis? And because how are the Democrats? They can't change what Trump is doing through the Congress. They can't even hold hearings because they don't control either the House or the Senate.
Right.
And so they can go out and sing songs and do their protests. They can do that. Or they can make these claims of constitutional crisis. And
well, what I hear when you say that is it's about process. What is a constitutional process? What is a proper judicial process, a proper legislative process?
Yeah, but you just hit the key word. So what the Democrats are, and when I say Democrats, I really mean the people who support government as it is, support the status quo. The one thing that they can do is go to the judiciary.
Right.
And that's what they have done. And they have found some judges who have ruled at the lowest federal court levels that what Trump is doing is unconstitutional. Now, this is the key thing. This is kind of interesting. I've heard pundits who are conservative, I've heard pundits claim that judge's ruling was itself a bad ruling and that Trump should ignore that judge's ruling because it was itself unconstitutional. But Trump, and I think this is a very interesting point, Trump is adhering to the rulings of judges that rule against him, and then he appeals it. And then that judge is getting overturned
Right.
at the appellate level, please.
So you change the law that way. Otherwise, you just have a refusal to follow a supposedly legitimate authority. And if you do that, then that is a crisis.
Yes.
But it's not a crisis to appeal it and then have the law changed through proper process.
Right. And so it's this, to me, the calling it a constitutional crisis, you have to be able to say, what is he doing? And one of them let the cat out of the bag in one of these back and forths on a panel member, and so the Scott Jennings on CNN was saying something, and the guy says, and then the guy and he said he is doing what the voters, Trump is doing what he promised the voters he would do, and this guy said elections don't matter.
Don't matter.
Don't matter. So, and Scott Jennings, what? I mean, it shocked. And now the guy realized what he had said. But that's really what the people who think that the federal status quo can only get bigger, it can never get smaller. They really mean that they really do mean that elections don't matter.
So you've heard of bureaucrats that ride out political administrations because they were going to go away, and they just keep doing what they're doing, and that's part of what underlies this constant growth and scope of power and spending.
Yes.
And so you get back to accountability, the things we talked about before, about the way the Constitution was structured to be accountable to the people, but also not to be over-responsive to the people, because 51% can vote to take everything away from the other 49, the tyranny of the majority.
Right.
Again, the major concern of the founders. So these principles we're seeing acted out. And one response I've seen is that we need more of our Constitution, not less of it.
And so
it was built to handle these kind of things.
Yes, and it's fascinating because you have state attorney generals who are suing Trump over certain things, and then you have federal employee unions who are suing Trump over certain things. But the process is going to go through now. The judicial system will determine whether or not what Trump is doing as president with the executive branch is in adherence with the Constitution. And what I want to do, Mike, is take three periods. One is a very short period, which is the period since the inauguration. But I want to compare that. I want to go back to FDR in the 30s, because as we talked about, history can be a great teacher.
Before you do that, let me just make one observation. We're talking about different time scales on which things happen. We're seeing things happen in hours. Where you sign an executive order, it's different from 1 minute to the next, right?
Yes.
There are some of these things that happen over days. You know, from a scientific point of view, tectonic drift happens inches per year, right? Evolution happens over hundreds of thousands of years. So you've got very long-term scale things going on. I'm referring to science, but in politics, you have, decades, you have years. It will take years for the law to catch up with some of what's going up now, for the law to be changed, to take into account some of the special issues that have come up. But meanwhile, we're seeing things change by the day and by the hour.
Yes.
And so we're going to talk about some historical parallels of that, I think, in the Depression, where things happened over a 5-year period that were different than what happened in the first year.
Yes. Yeah. And so let's get into that a little bit, because Roosevelt was elected in 1932, and back then you were inaugurated in March of the next year, not January, but in March. So he was elected.
That was set up to allow people to get to Washington when it took 6 months by stagecoach and preparing and all that, right?
Yes, correct. And then by
relic.
the time Roosevelt became president, that was outdated, but they didn't have any particular reason to change it.
Yeah.
And so later that did
Changed
change
to January.
January 20th. But anyway, so Roosevelt becomes president. Now, what's interesting is that I found there's a wonderful, wonderful book that I recommend, and I'm going to hold it up here. so people can see what it is. And it's New Deal Rebels by Amity, and I am terrible at last name.
I think you say it Amity Schlaze.
Schlaze,
but
yes.
I'm guessing.
Okay.
I have a story about that sometime about people guessing at pronunciations because I was in a publishing business where we discovered people had used things they guessed at and they used it all their lives and they thought it was correct. Well, so we'll say, we don't know how to say this, but we'll guess.
The Amity part, and she wrote another book called The Forgotten Man. Yeah. Wonderful book. Highly recommended. Yeah. But this book, what she does is she takes a compilation of speeches that were given in the 1920s all the way through the 30s. And to kind of capture what was going on at the time politically. And there was one speech that she came up with, and it's a speech given by the former governor of New York who'd been there for 8 years, Democrat, and he'd run for president as the Democrat nominee.
In 1928.
1928. And he was governor of New York, and his name's Al Smith. And I think you had something you wanted to mention about Al Smith contextually before I get to the next part.
Well, he had run, I think, for the nomination to be the presidential candidate in 32, and he lost.
Correct.
Okay, and so he then supported Roosevelt in 32, said, and this is like we saw in recent elections, particularly in the Democratic Party. You have a bunch of people contesting, and they get their candidate, and then they all line up behind it. That's kind of what happened.
Sure.
So this essay that we have that Amity Schlaze has found is from 1936, 4 years later, where he's completely disagreeing with what Roosevelt had done and pointing out what Roosevelt has said, which is the opposite of what he did. Right. The cognitive point I wanted to mention is that there are reasons for doing one or the other things. For instance, majority control. We've talked about this. There's a reason for being in favor of majority control. It also produces a tyranny of the majority. So people like filibusters when they're out of control. They hate them when they're in control. Right? You're obstructing democracy if you do a filibuster while I'm in control.
Right.
It's a vital protection of minority rights if I'm out of control. Right. So there's reason for both. And the point that I wanted to make, this is really kind of the idea behind my book on deep trade-offs, is that it's not wrong to have taxes. It's not wrong to cut taxes. Right. There are competing claims about that have to be balanced. The creation of the Constitution, because the government wasn't powerful enough. There's a reason to centralize power when you're going to war. Machiavelli had this problem in Italy where they were about to be taken over by the hordes and he wanted more government power. We're generally talking here about the problems of too much government power, right? And so my point is, it's not that one or the other side of these is always right. There's a competition between these things that have to be balanced. We're about to see one guy who was in favor of one way and 4 years later saying, no, that's bad.
Well, and it's also what I want to get to here is this question about, and Barack Obama made a comment one time. He said elections have consequences. And so that's true. And then there's the question of if a politician, especially running for president, makes certain promises when they're on the campaign trail, should they work hard to keep the promises, or do they really not matter? Is it a wink, wink, do what you want to anyway?
Say what you need to say to get elected, and then do what you want.
Exactly. That's one way of looking at it. And then the other one is you have platforms, and platforms historically have meant more than they do now.
So you're talking about party platforms that are written at their conventions and that are like a constitution. They're like a statement of what we believe in and how we're going to act.
And what we're going to do, yes. And so what Al Smith did was he gave a speech in January of 1936 where he was complaining in his speech. And he says, as a loyal Democrat, and by the way, the economy was not doing well by even 4 years later in 1936. And we'll get into the reasons for that later.
Depression was still in full force.
Absolutely, and so he gave a speech, and what he did was he quoted from the Democrat platform of 1932, and I just wanted to read two or three of those quotes because right now the one thing, even though Trump's favorability is the last poll I saw was 53%, but over 70%. Believe that Trump is keeping his campaign promises. So even people who don't think he's doing the right thing at least agree that he's doing what he said he would do.
Yes.
So I think that's an interesting thing. And do we want our politicians to do what they promised to do. And the answer to me is, if we say that politicians ought to be able to do whatever they want to, regardless of what they said they would do, it leaves the voters and it leaves our constitutional republic in a very, very difficult spot. Because how do you then vote for the change that you want if the person you're voting for is free to not do what they said, which they are legally free to do it, whether or not it's good? And so let me just read a couple of quotes here. This is interesting. This is toward the beginning of the Democrat platform of 1932. We believe that a party platform is a covenant with the people to be faithfully kept by the party when entrusted with power, and that the people are entitled to know in plain words the terms of contract to which they are asked to subscribe. The Democratic Party solemnly promises by appropriate action to put into effect the principles, policies, and reforms herein advocated, and to eradicate the political methods and practices herein condemned. Well, that's pretty straightforward, don't you think?
It's straightforward. It's rather elegant and beautiful, in my opinion, and it sounds like a constitution. It's like saying we commit to these things.
Yeah, and also it doesn't matter which party might say that. That's what the people who vote for the people of that party should then expect them to live by that creed.
Yeah, that should apply to a platform on either side. Whatever these things are, bigger government on one side, less government on the other, that preamble that you just read should apply in all legitimate platforms.
Yeah, and I don't know if you read that and then put that to a poll of voters, do they agree? Do they agree with that?
It's hard to disagree with that.
It's hard to. So here's the one right up there at the top on the planks. The first plank. We advocate immediate and drastic reduction of government expenditures by abolishing useless commissions and offices, consolidating departments and bureaus, and eliminating extravagance to accomplish a savings of not less than 25% of the cost of the federal government.
So this is just splendid to me because it sounds exactly like what's going on in the last month from the opposite side of the political spectrum.
Yes.
And it's being protested in very loud terms as if this is completely unreasonable and illegitimate thing to do.
And unconstitutional.
Yes.
A constitutional crisis. Okay. So, but in this case, then Al Smith goes on, that he was quoting from but then in his speech he goes on, he goes, well now, what is the fact? No bureaus were eliminated, but on the other hand, the alphabet was exhausted in the creation of new departments. And this is sad news for the taxpayer. The cost, the ordinary cost, what we refer to as housekeeping costs, over and above all emergencies. And then it goes on from there.
Let's just make a point for those who may not know the history. That period was known for a lot of alphabet agencies like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, or something like that. They called them the alphabet agencies because there were so many of them and they all went by acronyms. Yeah. And he's saying they exhausted the alphabet, creating all of these bureaus of government when just before they had said we're going to cut it by 25%.
Yeah, exactly. And so I want to get to, though, let's take a look at, we've got a graph here of federal spending that goes back to before the Roosevelt administration, and then it continues all the way up to the present. Right. But you'll note in that graph, you'll note the giant increase in spending right after 1933, right after Roosevelt took office. And what he did was, contrary to what he promised to do, he passed two major pieces of legislation. One was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which essentially took control of all of industry that was not agriculture. And agriculture back at that time was more than 50% in terms of employment. More than 50% of people worked in agriculture. When
you say they took control of it, does that mean ownership? Does it mean?
Great point. Thank you. They set prices. They set wages. They set distribution channels. There was one fellow who wrote a letter to Roosevelt who ran a tire company. It was not a large tire company. And he said, we make very good tires. We believe we make higher quality tires than our national competitors, but we sell them at a lower price because we keep our overhead low, and it is because we sell them it's our ability to sell them at a lower price that allows us to stay in business. Mr. President, you're making us sell our tires at the same price as our national competitors. They can spend more money on advertising, and if you continue to force us to sell at a higher price, so here we are. This guy's trying to give the customer a better deal,
right?
Okay, and he said, Mr. President, if you keep that, we will go out of business. I don't believe that's what you intend. So it's a very eloquent, very nicely stated letter. That's also in this book.
Well, the general point then is if you have these kind of policies, you're basically not letting the market work.
Yes.
You're not letting consumers make choices and producers respond to that.
Yes. And there was a term in those days that applied to that, and it was called fascism. And we've talked about this before. And fascism as an economic term is government control of privately owned business.
Yes.
So in other
control
words,
may mean ownership. It may not, but it's basically you're calling the shots.
Yeah, you're going to tell the businesses what their policies will be and how they have to operate. The government doesn't own the equity,
right?
But it certainly is capable of putting them out of business or helping some and hurting others. Yeah. And so at any rate, so Roosevelt also passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And it was the AAA, one again, alphabet agency, the AAA, and he set up the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to oversee that, and he took over all farming. And here's an interesting sidebar that I learned in this book, and that is that at that time, black farmers were mostly tenant farmers or sharecroppers, meaning that they worked the land and they got a share of the profits. But what Roosevelt did under this, because they believed that they needed to drive prices of food, this during a depression, believed that they needed to drive the price of food higher in order to have good economic results. I don't understand that at all, but that's what they did. So what they did was they paid farmers not to farm. Well, if you're the owner of the land and you're being paid not to farm, then you fire your sharecropper. And so black sharecroppers under the Roosevelt administration, they suffered terribly. And we're not talking about a few here and there. We're talking about millions of people. And so it's just interesting, the implications of this. So now we have...
Well, you have an echo of that during COVID.
Yes.
Where, people who had office jobs could just do it at home instead. People who had to produce something, had to deliver something, particularly the blue-collar economy, they weren't able to do that as well in the pandemic. And so they suffered greatly, and they wanted different policies about requirements to stay at home. Yeah,
or if you were a small manufacturer, can't work from home. If you're a small manufacturer, the equipment is at the factory. So that's a great point about how governments can do things that might have an intention. The stated goal is one thing, but the results of the actions are the opposite.
Well, the biggest one that comes to mind is cutting taxes often increases tax revenue because it expands economic activity.
That's what they claim. Increasing taxes.
Increasing taxes often reduces economic activity and reduces revenue.
Yes.
So there's not a direct correlation between tax rates and tax revenue. But in our discourse, usually those things are tied at the hip. We're going to raise taxes. And the idea is if you raise the tax rate, you're going to raise the revenue, when actually it may be the opposite. You raise the rate, you get less revenue. You cut the rate, you get more revenue.
Right. So going back to Roosevelt, when Roosevelt took the oath of office, the top marginal tax rate was 25%, and the average income person was paying about 10 or 12% in taxes. What Roosevelt did throughout his administration was not only raise the top marginal tax rates, he raised taxes on the middle class. And so, in fact, by 1944, at the end of the war, the top marginal tax rate was 94%. And middle-income people, to support the war effort, were in the 60% tax bracket. But before the war, you got the middle-income people got up to a 50% tax bracket.
And we're speaking of marginal rates here. This is the top rate on the last income that you got.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Thank you. And so what happened was government spending exploded under Roosevelt's first 3 years, under all these alphabet agencies. And the economy nominally recovered. The economic growth was 12, 13% in each of those years. So you look at the economic growth, you say, that's really good. But what you learn is the growth was tied almost exclusively to this giant increase in federal spending. And so when the federal spending had to stop because you couldn't just keep printing money, then we had a second depression within the depression in 1937 and 1938. and unemployment got back up to 20%. Stock market collapsed again, stock market is a really good indicator of true economic activity because it is the market responding to economic conditions expressed in the price of stocks.
And it's particularly forward-looking. It's not looking back and making adjustments. It's looking forward. What do we expect to make? And it's extremely sensitive, and it takes into account the perspectives of all of its participants.
Yes.
It's way smarter than any group of officials, bureaucrats, analysts who think they know what's going to happen because they can't take in all the information. A guy won a Nobel Prize for basically saying the price system is a sensitive and beautiful indicator that's way smarter than any group of analysts.
Yeah, and somebody once asked me, said, "Do you think the free market reaches equilibrium? Is it ever perfect?" And I said, no, it's not because the consumers make billions of decisions a day. And I said, and even if we ever did reach perfect equilibrium, we wouldn't be in equilibrium 1 second later. But the point is, it's always trying to achieve that.
Right.
It's trying to achieve perfection, and it never does. But the goal is it does, and it's the best way to be moving in the right direction in terms of the allocation of capital and what is produced.
Right.
So at any rate, so now we get to, and this was something else I learned in looking at the book. Roosevelt passed the National Recovery Act and National Industrial Recovery Act, and the law as regards to agriculture. Both of those were overturned by the Supreme Court 3 years later, and so they were in effect, and they did all their damage for 3 years. But under our Constitution, sometimes things work very slowly. And so the Supreme Court overturned them. Roosevelt lost the midterm election in 1938. Congress then repealed the acts that had already been overturned by the Supreme Court. And things started to actually recover because now the market system was in place, even though tax rates were high. And then World War II happened. And World War II destroyed the industrial basis of every country in the world except ours.
The major ones that were important were Germany, England, Japan.
Yes,
right?
And ours.
And ours. And those guys were decimated, and we were left with little competition for decades.
For decades, for like 2 decades. And also if those countries rebuilt in order to buy capital goods, they had to buy them from us, because we were the only place with the factories to build the capital goods, meaning machinery.
Machines, yes.
Yeah. And so at any rate, so now let's fast forward and look at Biden and what Biden did as president, because Biden always has many speeches, held Roosevelt up as the greatest president in the last 100 years.
And the idea there is that he brought us out of the Depression. He did all this government stuff that benefited us so tremendously that he lifted us up out of the ditch.
Yeah, that's what Biden, and I believe Biden absolutely believed that. And there are a lot of people who've written that he's done it. And if you look at just the economic growth for the first 2 or 3 years, you can say, well, that was certainly positive. But look at what Biden did. Biden then passed, and this is Byron York, wrote a very, very good column in the Washington Examiner reviewing what Biden did right after he took office. And it's really quite interesting. I'm just going to quote from the article. First, Congress passed a $900 billion COVID relief bill. And that was actually passed just after Christmas of 2020, as Trump was heading out the door. And Nancy Pelosi did that. Then once Biden was in the White House, he pushed the Democrats to pass his $1.9 trillion, and he called it the American Rescue Plan, which I find kind of interesting. The names, like the National Recovery Act, the American Rescue Plan, the names of these bills, it's just interesting to look. Then the second thing, and I'm going to quote here, but Biden, who fantasized about being a new Franklin Delano Roosevelt,
a transformational president.
Yes, did not stop there. Later in 2021, he signed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. Well, what did Roosevelt do? Part of his vast increases in government spending was public works, and it also was infrastructure. The Hoover Dam was part of it. Notre Dame's football stadium was part of it. So there are a number of giant projects around the country that were funded by Roosevelt's giant spending on public works. Biden passed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. Then he passed the Build Back Better Act, which actually that name, that was how it was touted, but it was actually, when it passed, it was the Inflation Reduction Act, talking about an oddly named
in terms of what happened.
Yes.
It produced about a 20% inflation.
Yeah.
Or like 8% a year over 2-3 years, something like that.
Yeah, so it did exactly the opposite. But here's the key part about the last bill in his article. And he says, so I'm just going to quote here, only now are we learning the true damage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Look at this from the Cato Institute. The Inflation Reduction Act was initially touted as a deficit-neutral bill with its 10-year energy and climate-related provisions projected to cost about $370 billion, offset with tax increases. However, in the incoming Cato policy analysis, Trevor Fisher and Joshua Locks estimate that the Inflation Reduction Act will cost $936 billion and $1.97 trillion over the next 10 years, and up to almost $5 trillion by 2050, because the Inflation Reduction Act, Mike, it expanded a number of the entitlement programs under the inflation, which has a very, very long tail. And so this gets back to a couple of other, I'm going to digress just a tad, but on this same subject. When Medicare and Medicaid were passed in the 1960s, they were projected, Medicare in particular, it was passed in 1960, I believe 1968. But when it was passed, it was projected that the annual cost of Medicaid in 20 years would be $8 billion. It turned out to be $88 billion when you got to the 20 years later. But once the spending on an entitlement is passed, the spending is actually on autopilot. And Congress does not. Congress, I guess, just appropriates money to fund it, but they have no control over the cost of it. And
once they create the entitlement, it depends on the uptake, how many people sign up for it, because they've committed to whoever signs up for it, we're going to pay.
Right.
So in each of those cases, I think it was 3 times. In the most recent one, the inflation, the amount spent was 3 times what was projected.
Yes.
You just mentioned one that was 10 times.
10 times.
It's interesting to think about, for instance, the difference between defined benefit and defined contribution.
Yeah.
You remember this, when corporations used to have a lot of pensions, I don't know many that do now. But
well, they still have pensions, but they are defined contributions.
Yes, this is my point.
Yeah.
Defined benefit pensions used to be standard, meaning you're going to get X amount of money every month until you die. Well, that's a huge risk, with inflation and all the changes that happen. Their costs were growing out of control to the degree it was going to bankrupt companies. So they began to say, we're not committing to a defined benefit, what you're going to get. We're going to commit to how much we will put in on your behalf.
Right.
Right. And then it's up to you to save that, to use it, but we're not on the hook if it's poorly managed.
Right. And then a lot of companies have what are called 401ks, where they will put in a certain amount that's matched. They will match a certain amount
of what you put in.
But once again, that's a contribution. And
right.
By the way, anybody who is with a company that has a 401k, you should always do as much of that as you possibly can, because the contribution costs nothing, and then it accrues tax free.
Well, when my daughter was starting out, I said, you have to match. You have to put in as much as you can that's matched because it's 100% return on investment.
Yeah.
Immediately after they put the investment in, you've doubled your amount that you put away.
Right.
You're not going to get 100% in any other investment.
Right.
Never
not automatically.
Yeah.
Not automatically.
Yes. Not very often otherwise.
Right.
It's usually more like 5, 10, 15%. A really great investment might get 20, 25.
Yes.
Very rarely do they get 100.
Right.
And so the point was you've got to put as much money as you're allowed to put away on those terms because you can't beat it.
And the other part of it is the tax preferences on 401ks are tremendous. So they accumulate over time, and not having your gains taxed as it grows has a profoundly positive effect.
Yeah.
During the time of the growth.
So we've talked about Social Security spending being one of the vectors of runaway spending in the government. You know, George Bush the second, the 43? Was he the second
43.
Bush? He tried to privatize Social Security and make what he called an ownership economy where those accounts are yours, right? And that was greatly resisted because it took a lot of control away from the government. And now you look at Social Security, it's a defined benefit plan.
Yes.
It's not a defined contribution. It's not the government says, we're putting this much on your behalf and you're on your own. It's we're obligated to pay until you die X amount. And that's why the spending is running away.
Yeah. Now, here's an interesting point about Social Security, Mike, and it was passed. The Social Security started under Roosevelt. The very first tax on Social Security was 2% of your first $3,000 of income. So it was $60 a year. Was how much the employee contributed to Social Security. And Roosevelt also, at the time, he promised that it would never go up. And he also said this is not a welfare program. This is an insurance policy. This money goes into a Social Security account. He said, in your name. You remember Al Gore ran on the famous lockbox in 2000, Social Security lockbox.
As if this was put away in your name, and none of it is.
None of it is. But
it's all based on what they are going to tax future people to pay you and I as we retire and grow into our dotage.
Right. Now, for a period of time, the Social Security fund did grow, but then the federal government then borrowed the money to pay for other expenses. And so you could say technically that there's some money there, but it's all borrowed, and the creditor is not the creditor, the debtor is us. It's the federal government.
One other thing to take into account is that the demographics that underlie this. When it was created, I think you are eligible at age 65.
Correct.
And most people live to 67 or 8.
62 actually was life expectancy. There were some who lived past 65.
Okay.
But at that time, life expectancy was 62.
So most were dead before they ever were entitled to collect anything.
Right.
So you don't really have that many people to pay out. And the ones that they do pay out, they don't live 30 years. They live a few years. So the demographics of that are way more manageable than here. I've said we live in a glorious time. It's because we can maybe reasonably expect to live to 80 and even 90. It's not unusual anymore. But the financial consequences of that are vast.
Yes. Now, but let me what Roosevelt did was he made a bunch of promises to get it passed. There was a senator named Clark who offered an amendment, and I did not know this until just recently from this book, to give people a choice of either accepting the Social Security plan as legislated, or they could take their contribution and put it into a private account. They'd still have to put it in there. They'd still be taxed, or they'd still have to have money removed from their paycheck, but it would literally be put in what would be considered today an IRA, a private IRA. And that was voted down. That amendment did not pass.
To allow people a choice.
To give people a choice. And let's talk a little bit about what the effect of that is from a standpoint. You know, when you think of somebody who is wealthy, there are two ways to think about wealth. One is income, and one is what somebody actually has.
Assets.
Assets, yes. And if somebody's making, if you said, who would you rather be? Somebody who's making $1 million a year, who spends $1 million a year, or someone who makes $500,000 a year, who has saved over the years and has $5 million in stocks? Which one is wealthier? And I believe that the accurate answer is the one who has the $5 million in stocks, even though the other person is making twice as much money.
So somebody may have a high consumption lifestyle. Let's say a professional like a lawyer or a doctor has no assets because they've saved very little of it. They spend every year pretty much what they make. Mm-hmm. They look rich because they live to a very high standard, but lose that job and they are the poorest of the poor.
They've got problems, and so. Yeah. But when we're talking about Social Security and we're talking about whether it would have been, what would have happened had the Clark Amendment passed, and let's look at it demographically just a little bit, because this is very, very interesting. A black person who made exactly the same amount of income throughout his or her entire life as a white person pays the same amount into Social Security. But the average black male life expectancy is 68.
You talking about in the 30s or now?
I'm talking about now.
Right now.
I'm talking about now. So if they had been working for the last 50 years, 40 or 50 years, and they'd been putting money into a Social Security system plan that was theirs, like an IRA, then if they had died at age 68, which is the average life expectancy of a black male, a black woman lives slightly longer. White men live to be 76. White women live to be 78. So on purely a racial standpoint, Social Security, you could argue, is a system that's designed to tax black people more than white people compared to their benefits, because they receive literally only 30%.
So I think a more accurate way to say that is they're taxed the same, but they don't benefit the same.
Yes. But if the money were put into an IRA and somebody dies at age 68, the money goes to their heirs. To
their estate.
It goes to the next generation. And so a big part of the disparity in our country, frankly, is intergenerational wealth. And if somebody's parents have made money and set that aside, and then they inherit it, they start with property that their parents willed to them.
You know the easiest way to make $1 million?
What's that?
You start with $2 million.
Okay.
So, if you inherit money, if you're smart, and, somebody like Donald Trump, he inherited some millions, maybe tens of millions, and it's made it into much more. It's much harder to make the first $1 million because you just don't have as much to ante.
That's
right?
A fair point, yeah.
And so your point is confirmed, though. It's intergenerational wealth. You have an advantage if you've got something to start with.
And also the growth of our country has been intergenerational.
Right.
I mean, we've continued to be more and more and more prosperous as a country in the aggregate, but not everybody has participated in the same way. And I would argue that the main reason that the people have not participated in the same way is that that legislation that was passed in the 30s to provide for retirement benefits was passed in such a way so that people received the benefit. They paid into it their entire life and then received it. And if they died right after or even before, if you died before the benefit was even eligible, you didn't get anything, and your family didn't get anything. And so I think that that's a big opportunity, and George Bush tried to make that change. Politically, he was attacked for trying to rob Social Security, and people do not like change. Voters do not like change, and I think that's one of the reasons that Trump has been very clear. The Social Security and Medicare are two programs that he's not going to change because people have paid into them their entire lives.
Is it fair to say then that building wealth basically is dependent on ownership?
Yes.
You have to own it and manage it and control it yourself.
Yes.
I used to work with a guy when we were doing Knowledge Products, and I was hiring these narrators, some of whom lived in London, like Ben Kingsley, on our Great Ideas of Religion. And the agent that I used to hire Ben Kingsley had lived in London. I said, tell me about that. I think it's fun place. There's all this history. Lenin lived here. Trotsky lived there. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto over here. I was fascinated by that. I said, what's it like to live over there as opposed to the United States? He said, you can't make any money there. Cost of living is so high and the tax rates are so high that almost anything you make, you're going to spend up, if not more. So you cannot build wealth in an economy that takes all of your income for expenses and taxes.
Mm-hmm. Now, so what we've talked about the 1930s and that Roosevelt spent enormous amounts of money, contrary to what he promised in the platform. We then show that he also raised taxes and then created a second depression. But people like Biden believe that Roosevelt actually got us out of the depression. So then Biden comes along and spends a lot of money. We have inflation, and now Trump is president. And Trump made solemn promises during the campaign, and he made the same solemn promises over and over again. And now 70% of the voters believe that Trump is keeping his promises. And so now we get into this question of constitutional crisis, which I'm circling back kind of to the beginning, and that is it a constitutional crisis for a president to keep the promises that he made, in Trump's case, as a candidate, and by slashing government? I mean, he made it clear that he was going to slash regulations. He was going to slash the size of the federal government when it comes to the regulatory side of government and the giant number of people. And so now he's doing that, and the reaction by the opposing party is not to challenge him on his truthfulness, but to claim that what he is doing is constitutionally creating a crisis. So how can you argue on one hand that we are a democracy, that we are a representative government, and then have politicians who call for the great shrinking of government, keeping those promises, and it being a constitutional crisis?
You know, if you want to suspend the rules, you declare an emergency. And that's really what I see going on there. So we don't want to follow these rules. We have a constitution that can deal with these things, but we don't like the consequences of that. And so we're going to have a fight over those rules, and we're going to declare an emergency so that those rules don't apply in the way that they normally do. That's part of what I hear going on to slow this down. And some people equate reduction of government as the destruction of government.
Yeah, and you know, when we talk about this constitutional crisis, it's interesting to talk about this because when Biden was president, for the first 2 years, he controlled the House and the Senate. And the Democrats did pretty much what they wanted to do. And then the voters looked at that and said, I don't like those results very much. And so in the last election, they changed, and Republicans have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And quite frankly, it seems to me that is exactly, I did not personally think that Biden's policies were good, but I had to live with them because that's what our constitutional republic, that's how it works. Now, I like living in Tennessee. I would purposefully, if somebody offered me, even over the years, if somebody offered me an opportunity to move to California, I would not have taken it because I don't like the laws and the rules in California. And that's the beauty of our country, is that we have 50 states that have their own set of laws, their own state constitutions. And so we as Americans can choose what types of laws we want to live under and how large we want the government of our state to be. And we do that through state elections. And
yeah, I agree with this. And my way of saying is I distrust universalism. One size does not fit all. We don't need one rule coming from Washington that tells us what the minimum wage is in the whole country. It's way too different. What should be the minimum wage in New York is their business, and it's very different than the number they're going to come up with in Wyoming. Right. And so that's a great strength for us to have what some have called, 50 laboratories. And let's see which ones work the best and then expand those to other states if they see that it's working best.
Yeah.
But again, the choice underlies this. We were talking earlier, and I was thinking, we're talking about choice in retirement plans. Do you save your own money or are you forced to put it into a federal system? Usually if you talk about choice today, the first thing that comes to mind is abortion. Pro-choice means what it means in the context of abortion. Increasingly, it's now meaning schools. Do you get to choose where you go to schools? But I think you broaden this point to say that markets are giving you choices. The government is defining your choices, generally limiting them. A proper government, in my view, is one that promotes choice for people and improves their control over things.
Well, certainly when it comes to economic questions, because that's how the market is going to provide the best products at the lowest possible price. But what's fascinating to me is looking at the history of the last approximately 100 years. What we saw under Roosevelt was the beginning of a paradigm change, right. And that was government started to become bigger on a constant basis. Before Roosevelt, it got bigger and smaller, depending on whether or not we were at war. But Calvin Coolidge gave a speech in 1923, and in that speech he said that we were spending $2.6 billion on national defense and $400 million on everything else at the federal level. $400 million ran the entire federal government, not counting national defense, in 1923. If you increase that 1,000 times, it would be 400 billion. But we're at well over 4 trillion. So it's the size of government, and this is what's so fascinating to me as somebody who has lived through ever-growing government, and no matter what the politicians said they were going to do, even if they tried, they failed to cut the size of government. There's a podcast with 3 former Obama people on the podcast. And on one hand, they're complaining about what Trump is doing. But then one of them on the podcast the other day said, well, we tried to do these things, but we failed. And I'm a little angry that Trump, he was laughing. I'm a little angry that Trump is succeeding where we failed. And so
it's not enough that I should succeed. Other people have to fail as well.
So he was saying that laughingly. But it is our constitutional form of government, Michael, amazes me. And I hope that people who are listening to this podcast get a sense of how our history has evolved and why, as you say, we live in such a wonderful time.
And how blessed we are to be the benefactors of this,
yes.
The beneficiaries of this. I think Warren Buffett says we've won the greatest lottery in human history to be born into this country. And it's because of these principles that have allowed us to have this kind of prosperity, this kind of population growth, and we're richer and healthier than people have ever been in human history.
Right. And what I want to do on our next podcast is I want us to look at the grand time of history from probably around 1900. We're going to go back to, and we're going to be using the stock market. We're going to be using tax rates, and we're going to be using economic growth and federal spending. And we're going to be looking at those things because some people might say, well, if federal spending is bad, how come the stock market has gone up so much in the last 25 years? And that's a very good question. And we're going to try to address why those two things can happen at the same time. We're going to be discussing that, Mike, in our next podcast.
I look forward to it.
Great. Thank you.